No, it's great to be in the Carnage house. I love a bit of Carnage.
Boys and girls, welcome back to your favourite show. This is the Carnage House Productions podcast. I'm your host, Dougal Cameron. Today I have with me a man who has been on this podcast before 2 years ago, and lots happened in between. He's a very big player in the Animal Justice Party and the animal rights scene in Australia and New South Wales in particular. And I actually missed seeing him when I was in Upper Hunter when he was the Animal Justice Party candidate for Upper Hunter. But he's got a lot of credentials, PhD candidate, almost finished, he tells me, in science. Podcast host of Morality is Hard, vegan space scientist on YouTube, general advocate of animal rights, Michael Dello-Iacovo. Thank you for joining us. Hi,
Dougal. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's really good to be back. Nice to see you again after 2 years.
Yeah, well, it's good we haven't been cancelled. There's a chance that, I'm happy to be here. And a lot has happened in the last couple of years. And the Animal Justice Party, I was surprised to see you guys as a lot of people were surprised to see me with the LDP up at the Upper Hunter by-election. And I've seen you running, is it as a candidate in a few different elections. So what's been going on with you and the AJP in the past couple of years for all the viewers? And why don't you give a brief introduction to the AJP for new viewers?
Yeah, happy to. So the Animal Justice Party, we political party formed in about 2011, and we formed because of a frustration of our founding members that there wasn't enough concern about animals in Parliament. And most laws are made in mind of humans and don't really consider how it impacts non-humans. So whether that's domestic animals, animals in farms, or companion animals, or wild animals, most laws don't really take into account, we would argue, enough their interests. So we were formed to try and create legislative change in Parliament to change laws to improve the lives of animals. And so whether that's at a federal level, state, or council, we're running all of those elections. We're trying to make sure animals' interests are covered.
And the AJP does have several elected members. Is it 2 in New South Wales, 1 in Victoria?
That's right. Yeah. So for state, we have 2 in New South Wales, 1 in Victoria. And I believe we have 2 elected councillors in Victoria now as well.
Very nice. And I was having a look at a couple of the parliamentary profiles of a few of them, but have there been any victories for the AJP in any of the states, or things you can point to about what you guys are happy to have achieved so far?
Yeah, happy to. So we have had some wins. Being a minor party, it's sometimes a bit of a struggle to get runs on the board, but I think we have had
I'm
some,
actually part of the LDP now, and they're minor.
Right.
But yeah, I feel your pain, but continue.
Yeah, so one of our big wins is that we've had 6 councils across Australia go fur free. So that means they don't allow the sales of fur on council land. So it's small because, I mean, when you think of council land, it's not all of the land. It's not like every single shop in the council doesn't sell fur anymore, but it's things like markets that are on council land and that kind of thing. So they're not allowed to sell fur anymore. This follows, Berkeley was one of the first councils in the US to pass this change. It sounds small, but I think it's symbolic because it means the council is saying that they don't think that industry is acceptable. We've managed to increase the penalties for animal abuse in New South Wales. A lot of the penalties for animal abuse in Parliament, in our legal system, they're not reflective of the act that's been committed. So we've been able to increase the penalties.
Can you give an example of like a penalty that might have been increased, or something that's not like proportionate or wasn't proportionate before?
Sure. I'm not, like, off the top of my head, I can't think of like a specific example. There was an example last year. I think this was in Western Australia, but it's pretty, I guess, symbolic of the situation. They ran over an emu on purpose and were fined something like $1,000, give or take, and that was it. And just related to that as well, so New South Wales has recently become the first state in the country to ban anyone convicted of serious animal abuse offences from working or with animals or owning animals again. So one example of that, why that was brought about in the first place, is a Sydney petting zoo operator was allowed to continue working with animals in that role, despite having previously been jailed for stabbing a dog with a pitchfork and hanging them up on a tree to die. And yeah, so that they went to jail for that, but they were still able to continue to work with animals in their role as a petting zoo operator. So with this new legislation in New South Wales, New South Wales is the first state in Australia where that's not allowed, because we think that if they've demonstrated that in the past, then they're just clearly not fit to work with animals. So that just doesn't make sense.
Right. I see on the website, you just triggered my memory about one of the things that the party platform runs on is stricter penalties for animal abuse and crimes against animals and things like that. Is it like you? I for one have no idea about crimes against animals in any like legal sense. But is it a position that generally just the punishments that are being received are not proportionate, or is it just that there's a general instinct that any crime against animals should be really seriously punished? Like, is there like an end to that? I guess is my question. Like, if in terms of maintaining proportionality compared to like human crimes or something. Like, do you get what I'm kind of asking?
Yeah, I think I get what you're asking. I have to admit that area of policy is not exactly my expertise either. Especially with that the court system, it's not something I know a lot about. But I guess what I can say is, I think the idea is that we make the punishment more in line with the seriousness of the crime that's being committed. So I think pretty much everyone could agree that a $1,000 fine for intentionally running over an animal is probably not enough, and we want there to be enough of a repercussion for committing these acts that it's actually a deterrent.
Right.
I think the argument is that it's simply not enough of a deterrent in some cases, where the punishment is so low that it really just doesn't stop anyone from committing these acts of animal cruelty. So they need to at least be high enough that it is going to make people not want to commit these acts. And I guess how high they should be, I suppose, is open to argument, and I don't know really what my position would be specifically on that, but I think they definitely should be higher than they are now. Right.
I remember last time we spoke, you were, as I think you still are, leader of like the youth wing of the AJP, and you were looking to get into potentially some elected roles, and you obviously ran an upper hunter because I saw you on the ballot sheet, even though I couldn't see you at the booth. We're obviously different booths. What have you been up to personally in your political capacity over the last couple of years, and where do you want to be? What's your future looking like?
Sure. So first, I just have to correct you a little bit there. I'm actually I haven't been the leader of the youth wing for I think about a year and a half now. I stepped down from that role. I did stay on the committee.
Someone's getting fired on this end. My crack researchers are obviously losing their job.
But I actually did step down from the committee entirely just about a month ago. So no longer in that role anymore. I turn 30 next year, so won't be in the youth wing for too much longer, unfortunately.
All right. They kick out the oldies, do they?
Once you get to 30, that's it. No, so I think the youth wing is still going really well. Still very proud of what I was able to achieve in my time there. I was one of the first members. In fact, the youth wing is why I got really active with the Animal Justice Party in the first place. I had been a member for 2 years before the youth wing was founded, but I really only started to get active when I heard there was a chance of a youth wing starting up. So for anyone who's not aware, Young Animal Justice Party is it's by young people for young people, and it's the the part of the party that focuses on things like youth development, giving skills for young people in political advocacy and activism, and professional development skills in general. So public speaking. It's a place for young people's voices to be heard in the party, and it's also a place for young people to be active and involved in political advocacy and volunteering. So, for example, we have talks from staff from Parliament to come and talk about what it's like to be a politician or what it's like to be a political staffer. We have volunteering, probably shouldn't say we anymore, I guess, but the Young Animal Justice Party has volunteering opportunities to get involved, like, for example, going to work at volunteer at a greyhound rescue centre to work directly with animals.
Mm. And how have you found, not elected yet, but how do you feel like the political process is going? Have you been encouraged or disillusioned, or how do you feel like the political process incorporates like the voice of a minor party, for instance?
Sure. So I actually just remembered something I wanted to say. The Upper Hunter by-election, that was for me at least, that was fairly last minute. I wasn't intending to run. I mean, probably no one was. It's a by-election, but
it happens. The minor parties.
Yeah, I mean, I stepped up just to fill that spot, I guess. Personally, don't live in the Upper Hunter area, but was keen to get involved.
Animals do. Animals.
Of course. Yep, plenty of animals up there. Anyway, so I don't think I've become more disillusioned. I think I'm pretty much bang on where I was a few years ago. So yeah, as you said, I've run a few times now. I'm actually also running in the council elections later this year, running for Inner West Council in the Gulgadja-Leichhardt ward. So that'll be my fourth election.
All right, well, we'll put all those links in the description. I know you're rattling off the youth wing, and we'll put them all in you just have to send them and put them in the description.
Sure. So yeah, I think one thing I'll say is I think it's easier to get elected as a minor party, member of a minor party, than probably a lot of people think. I mean, it's still hard, and it's harder than being in a major party. But in the upper house, for state and federal, especially for state, it's a lot easier to get elected as a minor party member than it would be to get elected to the lower house as a minor party member. So because you need a much smaller percentage of votes, and you can get in with preferences much more easily.
Yeah, no, that's what the LDP did with Lionhelm. He slipped in with hardly any of the major party votes, and that's probably the first primary vote, whatever it's called.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so I think it's probably easy to have members elected of a minor party, and to be able to get into Parliament and start making some changes than probably a lot of people think. For council, this is probably the first time in New South Wales, at least, that we've made a really serious go of running for council. So I guess we'll see what happens, but I'm feeling pretty hopeful that we'll get at least a few members in New South Wales elected to council. Hopefully following the success of Victoria, we had 2 members, as I said, elected to council. And council, I think you can still make a lot of meaningful changes for animals. It's obviously a much more local focus, but there's still a lot of issues that affect animals at the council level. So if we can get a few members elected, which I think we will, then it'll be really good.
I guess one more thing I wanted to ask was, you've been in this party for a while. How long?
I think I've been a member for about 4 or 5 years. 5 years, I think, coming up on, yeah.
Right. And so the Animal Justice Party is like predominantly, at least it seems like to me, a one-issue party. Has your like primary interest in that one issue of like animal rights or animal justice kind of remained the same throughout that time, or have you kind of felt like more passionate about other issues and things like that, or are you pretty happy on the one issue being your main one?
Yes, first I'd want to push back just a little bit on us being a single issue party. I know that comes up a lot, and I can see why people would say that, but animals are so affected by so many different issues. Every single legislative change, almost every legislative change will impact animals in some way. So, I think I wouldn't quite say we're a single issue party. I think we focus primarily on animals, but so many different issues affect animals that there's a lot of issues that we have that we focus on. So You're asking about me personally, though, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, like,
so,
do you really want to say something about like interest rates occasionally, or are you like fairly happy with where you are?
So I have several different interests, and for a long time, animal rights and animal protection has been one of my main interests. Politically, I'm happy for it to be my main interest because I think there's some value to be had in becoming quite focused on a particular area of issues. You know, if I am elected and interest rates happen to come up in legislation, I have to do my research and have an opinion on that. Yeah, so I mean that's what our elected members do when they focus on animal issues, but when other issues come up, they work out what they have to they think the right position is. For me personally, I mean in other areas of my life, I have other interests. So in 2016, I worked with a international development charity and was briefly the CEO of Effective Altruism Australia. And for many years, even before I became vegan or became really interested in animal rights, I was most passionate about international development. And then I became passionate about climate change and then animal protection. And then I'm also interested in ensuring that the future of humanity and life on Earth is going to be is going to be good.
Space scientist you are.
Yes, well, that's exactly right. I mean, I've got into my PhD in space science to look at asteroids and look at asteroid deflection and off-Earth mining because of my interest in ensuring that the future of humanity is good. So,
go
on, sorry.
Well, so if we find some like cool mining on like different countries, like some cool resource or something, it might be, the animals presumably won't be affected if we can mine stuff on Mars.
So the environmental benefits are actually one of the arguments for off-Earth mining, especially if the resources are being used to fuel space exploration or some other space industry that doesn't exist yet. But you can imagine if you wanted to say, some people have talked seriously about putting solar panels on the moon and then wirelessly beaming electricity back to Earth via lasers and using that as an energy source. Physically possible, hasn't been done yet, but at least not that scale and distance. But if we could get the materials we need to do that by mining them off the moon, that saves a lot of launch costs. That saves you having to mine them on Earth, which obviously comes with some amount of environmental damage. And yeah, exactly. So my PhD has been looking at the use of geophysics, so prospecting and using physics to try and find out what's under the surface, but with a focus on off-Earth exploration. So, for example, how can we use seismic, which is a form of sending sound waves into the Earth to build up a picture of what the subsurface looks like, and then applying that to how can we find, say, ice or silica or whatever we want to mine from a moon, an asteroid, Mars, and how can we find those and how can we turn those into resources that we can use?
Well, I got one additional final question before we get to the first break. Is with you've mentioned you're passionate about climate change. Considering the environmental impacts of mining, and I'm associated with a lot of people, at least in my space, of people who either don't believe in climate change or don't agree with any policy that addresses it. I personally have no opinion on it yet because I haven't looked at it at all. But the party which I'm part of, the LDP, is very big on nuclear energy, and I guess it's a politically unpopular issue in Australia because there's a sense among people that nuclear energy is like environmentally dangerous and damaging, and to people as well. And there's obviously the examples of nuclear reactor muck-ups in Japan and other places. Do you personally, or does the AJP have any thoughts on nuclear? Because it seems like it could be at least from where I'm standing, a really good middle ground in terms of doesn't produce any carbon dioxide or emissions or whatever. I'm very educated on this. And also, so you can meet your net zero climate goals, whatever, but it's also a very efficient energy resource. And do you have anything to say about that, or does the AJP have a policy on that?
Sure. So to my knowledge, the Animal Justice Party does not have a policy on nuclear specifically. We have policies about wanting to progress to clean energy, renewable energy, and so on. But I don't think nuclear specifically is covered in that. Not at least nothing specifically for, nothing specifically against. Me personally, I'm actually quite positive on nuclear energy. So I mean, like you say, it sounds like a good middle ground between people who want to reduce emissions and people who, I mean, there's a lot of overlap with, I guess I'm trying to think of how I can word what I want to say, but I think perhaps the politically right, which tends to be more pro-nuclear, I think, that's kind of a win-win situation where you could have both sides getting what they want. One side, gets the mining, and industry benefit that they want, and the other side gets the environmental benefits that they want. To make it way more simplified than that argument actually is. But I mean, I for safety, and there's been some really big public disasters. The reason I think why people often think that nuclear is more dangerous than it is because the nature of the disasters are when bad things happen, they happen really big. But for example, with say wind turbines often catch on fire. They have to be maintained. There's other downsides like. Does the
AJP have a policy on wind turbines? Yes, I'm pretty sure they regularly hit birds.
Yes, they do. I mean, that's a problem. Yeah. I guess it's the downside of wind turbines for sure. Yeah.
All right. Very cool. Now, we know we're famous for dribbling. I've done a bit of dribbling so far. But we got, as people, long-time subscribers of the channel know, we do a Penthouse giveaway for the Alpha Male section of the week. And that's the winter edition of Penthouse. Got some good articles besides the lovely spreads you'll find in there. Basically, all you have to do to win is comment in the comment section of this video who's been an alpha male of the week and why. Now, the alpha male does not have to be a male, can be an institution, can be anybody. And the alpha part of it just means someone who stood up for what they believed in, done something cool, maybe gone against the establishment. We've had a few great winners. You can check past videos, but up to you. We'll mail it to you for free. And when you win, we'll let you know and we'll send it to you. So make sure you comment on that and go get yourself a subscription to Penthouse if you dig it. Alrighty. Thanks for putting up with that, Michael.
No problem.
Now, the next thing I wanted to ask you about was ethics. And I think we briefly touched on it in the last podcast. And I remember an interesting kind of exchange we had where we were talking about, I guess, the value of a human life versus like an animal life. And I think one of the things you said was that the life of an ant, for example, is obviously not like as morally worthy as a human life. And given that I've recently just taken an ethics and philosophy class introduction at university, I thought we'd get into it a little bit.
Sure.
And one of the before we actually get into the proper ethics, I want to bring up this, as I mentioned to you before, this Steve Irwin debacle that happened a couple of years ago, and this is front and center of, I guess, Australian ethics when it comes to having a go at people who are maybe as popular as Jesus in the history of this country. Steve Irwin, when I know you haven't seen this before, but basically Google did a Google Doodle. You know how they sometimes do those, where they do like little animations on the Google thing.
Sure, yeah.
And basically, they had Steve Irwin cuddling a crocodile in like a rainforest or something, right? And Peter tweeted, Steve Irwin was killed while harassing a stingray. He dangled his baby while feeding a crocodile and wrestled wild animals who were minding their own business. Today's Google Doodle sends a dangerous, fawning message. Wild animals are entitled to be left alone in their natural habitat. So I wanted to ask, I know there's probably this might be a hot topic and a loaded question from the Australian public's point of view, but general thoughts on Steve Irwin and Peter's tweet, if you want to comment on it.
Great. Well, you've definitely put me on the spot. I was not aware of that. Love it. So, okay. Look, I actually don't know. I mean, they listed a few examples there, which I am only vaguely familiar with. So they say that Steve Irwin was harassing a stingray. I know that he was killed by a stingray. I don't know what he was doing at the time. Do you think that's a fair thing to say?
Definitely.
Anyway?
It would not have surprised me if he was wrestling with it, fucking with it,
okay.
doing all types of things.
All right. Look, I think obviously that was a very unpopular statement because Steve Irwin is so popular in Australia. Is even before his passing, he was a massive icon. I think the spirit of what they're saying, I think could well be true. There may have been, and look, I honestly don't know much about what Steve Irwin got up to, but I can certainly see that it's possible that he did some things that were not in the best interest of the wild animals. I think that part could be right. Steve Irwin's done a lot to, I guess, educate people in Australia and globally on what the life of a wild animal is like, but that may well have come with some downsides of, I guess, getting up in their business when maybe they didn't want that.
Well, I would say definitely who's getting up in their business. I mean, there's probably some crocodiles that didn't want to get wrestled like that. Maybe they thought it was fun. But the one of the cool things I do like about Steve Irwin a lot, well, two things. Firstly, is like, just on the crocodile example, but I feel like it probably extends to other animals, is a lot of the shows of the crocodile hunter was like farmers calling in and saying, look, I got this big crocodile on my farm. What do we do about it? And Steve will say, don't worry, don't kill it. I'm coming to get it. And then he would wrestle it, put a cloth over its head and helicopter it somewhere else, right? And I thought that was quite cool. And probably, would that be something that you generally approve of?
Yeah, personally, that sounds pretty good. And I think that's a good example of how if you hear like a headline of something, like you can very easily come up on the wrong side of something. Like at first it might sound like, bothering the crocodile, which was my first impression, but I wasn't aware that there was some extra context there that actually maybe that it wasn't the best interest of the crocodile.
Yeah, 100%. He's a great dude, and there's sometimes when you get in your feels on YouTube, you go and watch some of Steve Irwin's like last interviews. Like, I know I've done it, and one of the things they talk about is they say, so you became like a international icon, not just Australian icon. Like all the Americans know who the crocodile hunter is. He was on all their talk shows and stuff. And they're like, so what do you do with your money? And he says, well, I just buy land and turn it into like national parks or whatever and put animals back in there because, land actually does cost money. And as much as we want at the end of the day for everything to be, a natural, pristine environment, someone probably does have to pay for it. And that's what I'm doing with my money. I thought that's a really cool. I could nominate Steve Irwin for an Alpha Male of the Week, although he would get it every week. So I don't know if you've seen much of Steve Irwin, but he's one of my favorite people of all time. Put him on the $100 bill or something.
Yeah, sounds reasonable. I mean, I have to admit, I didn't know a lot about them. Maybe I should go watch some of these interviews. But
well, I tell you what,
it sounds like from what you're describing, it sounds like he did have the interest of animals in mind.
Well, I'll tell you what, you can get your fact checkers to check that out, but I don't know what the what the legality of it is, but if you can get some Steve Irwin branding and messaging coming through the AJP, I think that would probably resonate with people. We're doing
probably
what Steve
some
done in the
copyright
Parliament.
somewhere there. Maybe we'd have to call is there a Steve Irwin Foundation? Maybe we'd have to contact.
Well, his family's still going strong. I know Bindi just got married.
Yeah.
That made me feel a bit old. But yeah, all right. So in the ethics, there's this. I guess I came about it in my philosophy and ethics class in relation to euthanasia and abortion, and the discussion actually largely revolves around personhood, right? Being a person, which is actually, according to these philosophers, different than being a human being. Because being a person requires some rational and mental faculties that don't exist in some humans, like unborn babies or fetuses, and like really old people who are in palliative care and your permanent vegetative state, right? And so then the argument for euthanasia, for example, is that these human beings are not actually people when they've lost all their mental faculties. Therefore, it's okay to end their life, right? And this is just for the viewers, you'd already know this, but and the same argument is made with fetuses or unborn babies, which is that they haven't yet developed the faculties that make them a person. Therefore, it is okay to end their life, to painlessly end their life, because they're not yet a human who deserves like the moral consideration so they're not yet a person that deserves the consideration of an adult human. Now, the interesting thing about this argument is that when we define person on the basis of mental faculties, is that often some animals will score higher in mental faculties than really small children or unborn babies and those old people in human vegetative states or whatever the case may be. But interestingly, particularly toddlers, right? A lot of, humans generally consider toddlers like, potentially the most valuable of everyone. But when you base the criteria for moral, moral worth on rational faculties or, mental faculties, which are more present in something like an ape than they are in a child or in a baby, then the argument goes that potentially those apes should get greater moral consideration than children without, who don't qualify for personhood. And potentially I didn't do the best job of explaining that, and you can expand on that. But I just want to ask you, like, kind of what your ethical position is, presumably influenced by like Peter Singer, who wrote that famous animal rights book. And if you want to give like a general introduction on your thoughts and the Animal Justice Party thoughts on personhood and things like that.
Yep, happy to. So I'll speak mostly from my personal views on this one, I think. But so my my ethical views are fairly heavily influenced by Peter Singer. Don't agree with him on everything, but a lot of what he says I agree with. In particular, the ethical framework of utilitarianism, I think, is what I would call myself. So what that means is I think actions are ethically right or wrong based on the consequences of those actions, and the consequences I'm interested in is how it increases happiness and how it increases suffering or reduces either of those two. So I think suffering is bad of any conscious mind. Happiness is good. And so I'm interested in what are the consequences of actions and how does it influence happiness and suffering. And that's how I decide, I guess, whether an act is good or not. So an important follow-on, which brings me back to your question of that, is I'm interested in whether any individual animal or life form is capable of conscious experience, is capable of experiencing suffering, pleasure, emotions, and all that. So I think what you said is right, where for example, a lot of primates, even some other animals, can be as intelligent as humans, say, of very young age. But also, I think more importantly, is their capacity for suffering. So for mammals, for fishes, and for a lot of categories of animals, we are pretty confident they have a great capacity to suffer, and arguably on par with a human's capacity to suffer, comparably so, if not the same necessarily. So from that, I'd say that I think we can make a reasonable argument that non-humans are worthy of moral consideration. For example, if there's this concept of moral patients versus moral agents, not to get too into the philosophy, I guess, but a moral
don't worry, we have a very high IQ audience. Don't you worry about that.
Okay, good. So a moral agent is something like an adult human. They are not only just capable of experiencing pain, suffering, and feeling, but they're also able to rationally think about their ethical choices and to act based on some kind of ethics. Whereas we might say a 6-month-old human, now we'd call them a moral patient because they are still capable of experiencing pain and so on. But we wouldn't hold them morally accountable for their actions because that doesn't make sense. They're not developed enough to be able to do that. So they'd be a moral patient, but not a moral agent. And I'd put non-human animals in the same category of being as a 6-month-old human, for example, of being a moral patient, not a moral agent. But that still means that their interests should be considered.
Now, one strange thing when I was doing that subject was that it seemed like a lot of the literature coming out about personhood, like the philosophy papers, on both sides of the abortion argument, which I did a paper on, were motivated by finding philosophical justifications for what they already felt were correct, right? So on one hand, you had the, let's say, conservative side who were trying to find philosophical justifications for why it was obviously bad to kill a baby or an unborn baby. And on the, let's say, progressive side, you had academics trying to find justifications for why it's fine to kill a fetus. And it was actually funny because they were explicitly saying that in their philosophy papers. They're like, we need to come up with a reason that will actually satisfy the feminist movement, right? I'm not like attributing that motive to them. They say that.
Sure.
But one of the problems they ran into is that when they found the personhood argument, the criteria for personhood that if not met lets you kill a fetus, let's say, morally, is that you also run into this problem of why all those same arguments apply to babies, which most people would find pretty crazy. And specifically what I wanted to ask you about was like these philosophers come up with, or at least my philosophy teacher, so far as he represents the broader philosophical community, is basically comes to the conclusion that if an animal is sentient or a person is sentient or whatever, that they can feel pleasure and pain is the criteria for that, then it's not morally wrong to painlessly kill them, right? It's only morally wrong to kill them, with pain. And so, so far as they can experience pain and pleasure, it's wrong to inflict pain on them. But if you don't inflict pain on them and you kill them anyway, then that's all right. And that's then the argument they apply to, fetuses and even babies in some cases. So is it, from the animal justice position, right? If you're dealing mainly with sentient animals, but potentially in some cases more cognitively developed animals like primates, do you guys like consider a distinction among those animals with those extra rational faculties in terms of the rightness or wrongness of killing them, or are you just advocating on all of their behalves to not be killed or whatever? So
I don't think there's a lot of distinction in our policy between those different species and levels of mental faculty, because I think we're so far from even like most animals being considered at all in legislation that I think that's just like really putting
right, you've made it when you got to make those distinctions.
When we get to that fine level of detail, I think we'd probably be very happy that we've managed to get there, but we're so far from there. I think it's just not been really effective to even be talking a lot about that. So at the moment,
well, what do you think personally? What do you think personally on that? Like, would you say it's would you generally agree with like the philosophy which talks about that there's only harm in killing like an animal that qualifies as a person versus one that qualifies for sentience?
So yeah, I've had this conversation a lot with some friends. So I think it's extremely sometimes it's like pretty complicated, but I think so. What you're talking about really is like it's sometimes called the replaceability argument. So the idea is like if you could painlessly kill a cow and replace them with another cow, let's say both of whom are leading happy lives, is that morally bad or is that morally neutral?
Or even if you just kill a cow painlessly.
Sure. Yeah. So so from the utilitarian perspective, which is, suffering bad, pleasure good, if in theory, and also in like the isolated, let's say, thought experiment, you could painlessly kill some animal, then I suppose that act is morally neutral. That's my opinion, and that follows from utilitarianism. But whenever that comes back to something practical, like, okay, can we do this? Is it now fine to do this, let's say, in a farm or something? I think it becomes much, much more complicated than the simple thought experiment, because I think it's not realistic to be able to kill any sentient life without pain. I think there's always going to be at least a small amount of pain associated, but even if it's an instant death, let's say, it also raises the question of, so for example, I think that if it's morally acceptable to do that for non-humans, and I think that non-humans have somewhat as much moral consideration as humans should, it kind of raises the question of, well, is that okay to do for humans now? And yeah, I mean, I think so. In practical terms, if we had a society where that's how we saw death as being acceptable in any case, as long as it was painless, I think that leads to a lot of additional negative outcomes that might be hard to foresee or to predict. But it doesn't sound like that it'd be a good society to live in, right? I guess so.
Yeah. Well,
so while that's yeah.
Well, I mean, that's what I was thinking in my philosophy class, and it's when you're being taught by trained philosophers, it's hard to convince them out of their position with rational thought. But I've been thinking a lot about this in the past couple of months, is because they make some fairly convincing logical arguments that extend into human life, particularly babies. And why is it bad to kill a baby? You have to really think about that if you accept this personhood. If you accept this personhood criteria. But so would you be kind of aligned with the idea that it's generally bad to painlessly kill babies, and potentially also bad to painlessly kill animals? Because I'm quite enjoying that position that I'm in right now.
Okay, yeah, so as soon as we get away from the thought experiment and get into practicality, then yes, I'd agree that that's a bad idea. So I wanted to say something about abortion as well, where, I mean, if I think I would you can correct me maybe if this is not the position that someone who is anti-abortion would have, but I would think that someone who is anti-abortion would agree that let's say within seconds of conception, or hours, or even a day of conception, a human is not conscious. It's a few cells. So there's obviously some cutoff point somewhere where, or maybe it's a very gray area where you get from it's no longer just some cells, and it now has at least some small rudimentary level of consciousness. I have no idea where that is. I know some scientists have tried to approach this problem and try and say, okay, well, so they might say something like, abortion should be not allowed from this age after this amount of time after conception, because that's when we think that they now have some conscious capacities. So, I mean, that's how I'd be thinking about that problem, I guess, is, it's good because, again, from the perspective of, I care about I care about conscious minds, and I don't care about a rock for its own sake because it's not conscious. Then, it's I guess I'd apply that train of thought to abortion.
Exactly. And it's this weird gray area where, like, the real strong abortion, and like, they make some fairly strong logical arguments, which I don't really agree with in terms of setting up that personhood criteria. But it does seem to me, and I feel like most people who have their morality not grounded in like formal philosophy training, including me, feel like that there is some gray area where, like, the day after, a lot of people being in that position, you go take that pill, you go, a couple months after, that's a bit shit, but, maybe we understand. But, the day before you give birth, that's probably a bit too far. Like, there's probably somewhere in between. and I feel like most people agree on that. I think in Australia, it's mostly pretty accessible until like the 20-something week. And anyway, I think by that time, like, hopefully you would have already made your decision, and like that's probably a fair amount of time. But anyway, that's not. We're going to get ourselves in trouble here when we start talking about these things. Now, the next thing on an ethical question I wanted to ask you is, being a young man on the internet, on the line, as I am, I've consumed a fair bit of Joe Rogan experience.
Sure.
And he talks about his experience or his uncomfortability with the documentaries and videos that were coming out about factory farming, and didn't want to be a part of it or contribute to that. And that's why he personally took up hunting. And so he says, he will go in the wild, go on this kind of quite cool, almost some level spiritual, tapping into his inner masculinity or whatever, chase down an elk, kill it with a bow and arrow or a gun or whatever it is. And he'll go and eat that. That'll last him for like 9 months, and he doesn't go and buy meat, right? So he goes and that's his source of meat, and he just freezes that up. Do you think that there's a meaningful difference in ethics from your perspective on farming versus hunting, or is it? My guess is it'd be some utilitarian argument about the suffering in cages, but I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Sure. So I didn't know that about Joe Rogan. The only episodes of the Joe Rogan Experience I've watched are when he interviews a guest that I want to listen to. So
the space guys, the people get sucked up in UFOs.
I didn't. Does he? Okay, I haven't seen
one
ones.
like that. I haven't watched it either, but I've heard about it. He interviews a guy who's 100% convinced he got sucked up in UFOs, which is a lot more credible now that the Pentagon is releasing all of this stuff saying that UFOs do exist and we have no idea about them. But anyway.
Yeah, it's no, I haven't seen that one, but I have seen a little bit. So, I mean, okay, hunting versus factory farming is what the question's about. And there's obviously a difference. Now, I think I don't think I can say that. I guess this is a little bit coming back to the last question of a painless death. If you were able to painlessly kill an animal, then I would have to say that that's better than factory farming. I don't think it's the best outcome. Because
that elk's probably getting shot with a bow and arrow. Like, that's not dying and right at the start.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's what it's like in theory, but in practice, we know that a lot of animals who die in hunting died long, slow, painful deaths, and even in the best of cases, in the best of times. And at the end of the day, I think it's still problematic that you're taking the life of someone. So again, in practical terms, in a society where we feel like we're able to take the life of an animal just because we want to eat them, that, if it's not for survival, I think survival is an important distinction. If you don't need to do this to live because you have a supermarket down the road where you can buy some lovely vegan food, then you're choosing to kill an animal that you don't have to. And I think that's still problematic.
Now, does it make a difference? You briefly talked about the moral patient versus moral actor thing, which probably applies in this situation. But does it make a difference if a human kills it or if a predator kills it, or was it just that the human action, because they have the capacity to choose, is still in the wrong in your view?
Yep, good question. So I think just like I said, we wouldn't hold a 6-month-old baby morally accountable for their actions. I wouldn't hold, say, a lion morally accountable for killing a gazelle. But what I think, sorry.
Oh, sorry. You go. Sure. I cut you off too much
already. What I can say is, I think the suffering is bad, whether it's caused by a human or whether it's caused naturally. So to make this pretty clear, I think with an example, hopefully, if a human is harmed by another human, we see that as morally bad. But if a human suffers from some natural cause, let's say, I don't know, they trip over, hurt themselves, or they're attacked by some wild animal, we still think that the suffering is bad, and we still try to take steps to avoid that suffering, because we don't want that human to suffer regardless of the cause. But so if they get some disease, naturally caused maybe, but we still want to try and stop that suffering. So now when we get into talking about, okay, now how does that play out for wild animals, causing other wild animals to suffer? Very difficult, but there are some easy ones. There's some easy examples that we can look at. So we could, so let's say a population of wild animals who are suffering from some parasitic disease. Now, I think it's fair to say that suffering is still bad, and we prefer those animals don't suffer. So we can look at vaccinating those wild animal populations, or giving them protection against that parasite so that they don't suffer. And I would hope that most people would see that as good, because what we're doing is reducing the amount of suffering that they feel. It's really tricky and really case by case sometimes, because you have to think about how does this interact with the broader ecosystem to be able to be making these changes. But I don't think that's an argument for not thinking about reducing wild animal suffering at all. I think we need to think carefully about, can we safely reduce the suffering of animals in the wild? And if we can, I think we should.
And I guess one question, I know this is going to be a naturalistic fallacy, but is there something, I mean, when a predator kills a prey, which obviously involves suffering for the prey and probably non-symmetric pleasure for the predator, I mean, is there something that's naturally justifiable, do you think, about like a human hunting and eating an animal, or is that not relevant in your opinion?
I think it's not relevant. So I think when you're talking about a human, I think in my view, it becomes very clear. It's, if they don't need to do it, then they shouldn't be causing suffering. Like I said before, if there's other options there where they don't have to hunt and kill an animal, I think they should pursue those unless they absolutely need to for survival.
Very cool. Now, there's what have I got written down here? This is what I wanted to talk about before we get to fan questions. And sorry to all the people who've been asking fan questions, but I forgot to mention it so far. They are coming up. I know we briefly last time touched on some of the AJP social policies, and I don't really want to get into the social policies in particular. I just wanted to kind of extend this talk about ethics to maybe broader political issues. This came up in my philosophy class too, right? When people talk about, utilitarianism, for example, maximizing benefits and minimizing harms, let's say, and you have the option of, giving to charity for a relatively small amount that could go really far, which wouldn't make a huge difference on your own life. That's a good thing to do. You should do more of it, blah, blah, blah. I think charities are, good when they do their work. But this just might be taking my personal frustrations from my philosophy professor and asking you to deal with them. Because I know you did mention, I watched your video where you go through on your YouTube channel, let me just plug that again, the Vegan Space Scientist on YouTube, where you go through all those moral questions, and there is like discussion that you go into about, whether you're obligated to give to charity all the time and things like that. I know from my personal political opinions, is that I really like the way capitalism can lift people up out of poverty. And there's something that, it doesn't rub me the wrong way, but I almost feel like they're missing something when people say you can jump out of the capitalist system and give a lot of your money to charity because it'll go a really long way, without necessarily acknowledging how good markets have been in lifting people up, all over the world, for example. And so that when you do buy something for, let's say, selfish personal consumption, you are actually through that process lifting up a whole range of people through a chain of connections that extend all over the world. I wanted to ask you, personally and potentially about AJP, the Animal Justice Party. Do you guys feel like capitalism plays a positive role or a negative role overall?
So the Animal Justice Party does not have a policy on that. I can talk about my views.
To be fair, the Liberal Party doesn't either. You know, they say they do, but ultimately they don't.
Sure. So I personally, if I'm forced to pick a label, I'd call myself centrist, because I think there are problems with the left. I think there's problems with the right. And even on this issue in particular, I think there's upsides and there's downsides to capitalism. So I think you just mentioned some good upsides. I think there are some benefits in terms of lifting communities out of poverty in some cases. There are also a lot of downsides. So market failures, where things like negative externalities are not addressed properly by the capitalist system. So I mean, I guess to put that in brief, I think there's some benefits and some disadvantages. Now, I think we can do both. I think so in terms of having charities and having capitalist systems. I think we can do both. So
yeah, exactly.
The way,
failures.
Yeah. So the way I see charity personally is, I personally do feel like an obligation to be able to do what I can to help reduce suffering, especially where it doesn't really affect my life that much. That's why I've taken a giving pledge to give to charity, because the harm I personally experienced from not having an extra, whatever it is, couple $100 versus the benefit that has in someone else's life they're just not the same. The disadvantage I feel in my personal happiness is just not that much, because I'm fairly well off. So
which charities do you like?
So at the moment, most recently I've been very supportive of the Good Food Institute as one of the main charities that I've been donating to. So what they do is they support food, plant-based food technology, cellular agriculture. So we're talking about things like creating steaks out of, let's say, either creating them out of plants directly, or like taking, say, a cell from an animal and then developing that into like a steak. Right. And so I like them because I think it has a lot of potential for scale. If we can make food that looks and tastes just like animal products, but had no animal involved, and that's just a huge game changer. Like, you don't even have to make the ethical argument to someone if you can make a steak cheaper, taste better, or taste just as good. But I
don't usually bring in my producer Fiona, but Fiona has had some experiences with vegan steaks and things like that. You want to give like a 10-second review of your experience with non-animal animal products?
Some are really good, some are not as good. Just go through some trial and error, everybody, and you can find what you like.
Yeah, great. I can definitely concur.
No pun intended.
There are some good ones and there are some pretty bad ones. I think when I first went vegan about 6 years ago, I remember the vegan cheeses were mostly pretty bad, I felt like. And some of the vegan sausages were pretty bad. So but I mean, where the technology is getting better, and now they're making things like the Impossible Burger is made from plants, but what they've done is they've taken heme from the roots of a certain plant, and that's part of what gives an animal product like a steak its kind of meaty, bloody taste. So they've taken that from a plant and they've used that to recreate that aspect of say a burger in a plant-based burger. So the sky's kind of the limit, I think, with technology and what we can do with that in terms of creating better and better imitation animal products.
100%. Well, that would be a great note to end on if I didn't love the sound of my own voice so much. And I've got one more little comment / question, is that sometimes things just come to mind during the interview. It's like I'm channeling the Lord. So I was reading this, having a look at this cost-benefit analysis textbook one time, and it goes through like a lot of the kind of economic cost-benefit analysis that governments go through when they go do new projects, for example. And so if you're building a highway, right, you have to take in obviously all the costs of making the highway and maintenance and things like that. But then they actually also have to include the costs or the benefits of like how many lives that will save, right? So if you say replacing an old highway presents, 5 people dying in bad accidents or whatever, and they, in the cost benefit analysis, they actually have to put a dollar value on those lives, which is kind of a strange and weird thing to do. And on environmental damage and presumably on animal welfare is my guess as well. And that's where I see, a really good contribution that you and Animal Justice Party can make as well, is on projects like you say where animals aren't considered in legislation. And obviously it's weird to get tied up in dollar values when you're considering lives, but at the end of the day it's the government's job to spend money and they have to work out like how to do it. I guess there's not a specific question in that, but I don't know if you have anything to say about it.
Yeah, sure, I got something to say. So yeah, I remember when I first heard about this concept of assigning a dollar value to lives, there was something like 10 years ago, and I thought, how can you do that? That's so unethical. But I see the value, because I think it's you have to think about the reason why they do that. And I think this applies to governments. I think this applies to any company. I think this applies to individuals as well. If you're thinking about the good you want to do in life, we'd love to solve all the problems in the world, but whether we're an individual or a government, we have limited time and resources, and especially money. So we have to think about how can we, if we want to do good, how can we use that money most effectively? So for that example with the government, it might just look like they're assigning a dollar value to a life, but what they're probably more likely thinking about in the bigger picture is they have a limited budget from taxpayer dollars, which they have to assign as best they can. And you might not agree with everything that the government spends that money on. I don't personally, but they're making an effort at least to try and assign that money as best they can to do as much good as they can. So yeah, I think when you think about it that way, I think it does make a little bit of sense to assign a dollar value to a life.
All right. Well, God bless you guys. Hopefully you get some extra animal consideration in some of those projects. It's weird in the sense that everyone loves animals. I think, I saw the tagline of one of your articles recently, everyone loves animals, but they still eat meat. I mean, I still eat meat, but everyone loves animals and loves the idea of, happy animals like Bambi. And, if you guys can do some work getting some happier animals, I think that's some more well-treated animals and less abused animals, that potentially does the whole world a lot of good.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's the hope. I hope we will.
Now, there's a ton of links, which we have promised to go in the description, which we'll get to, but what's the main pages you want to direct people to before we go?
Sure.
Oh, sorry. Fiona just reminded me, our producer. Why don't you quickly wrap that out, and then I'll give you 2 fan questions before you go.
Yep, sounds good. So animaljusticeparty.org.au is if you want to hear anything more about the Animal Justice Party, and there's links to all the state branches there. It's got our policies if you're interested in that. Got information about how to be involved. So that's your one-stop shop for that. For me personally, I think you already gave plugs for some of my stuff. So there's the YouTube channel, Vegan Space Scientist. My website is michaeldello.com, but that's down at the moment because I have to renew the domain, but that will be hopefully back up soon. That's where I keep, that's my blog and where I keep all my stuff. And then my podcast is Morality is Hard, which is on iTunes and SoundCloud. I think that's about it. Anything else you think I didn't cover?
2 questions we got for you. First of all is you would have probably seen the infamous photo of the protester, quote unquote, punching the horse.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know if you've actually seen the video, he didn't actually punch the horse. What basically happened was he was actually sticking his arms out while the police were kind of riding their horses at the protesters. So Joel Jamal asks, what are your thoughts on banning police horses at protests? Presumably it's an unsafe environment for them, but they might have utility for the police. Is that an acceptable place to put a horse?
So I saw the picture. I hadn't seen the video.
Dude, I'll link you the video because you'll just instantly get disillusioned with the news. The guy got charged and just like put his hands out like that.
It's too late for me to be disillusioned with media. Sure. So, I mean, yeah, the reason why they use horses for crowd control is because they're very effective. And somewhere I saw something, don't know how seriously to take it, but someone made the case that one horse is worth 5 officers in terms of psychological impact in a anti-riot or anti-protest kind of situation in terms of crowd control. So
they're scary when you're up with them. They're pretty fucking big. I
haven't been up. I've been up close and personal with a mounted police officer on a horse, but I can imagine it would be scary. So there's a reason why they use them, obviously, but it's a very stressful situation, I'm sure, for the animal as well as the people involved. I'm sure they've obviously been trained, these horses, to be in that environment. But I think with any domesticated animal, I think we have to think about their interests as well as ours. With this example specifically, I don't know. I guess it would be a cost-benefit analysis that I'd actually have to do some research on to think about how stressful is the situation for horses? What benefit are they providing? Are the horses benefiting from the arrangement? Are they having happy lives? Those are questions I don't know the answers to, but those are the questions I'd be asking if I was to think about should horses be at these events. I think that's all I got for that one.
Well, I think you're giving some good answers off the dome, which bodes well for your future political career. And one more final question from James Ridge, who, judging by his Instagram, is a farmer. He asks, what are your thoughts on shearing? He adds, the fleeces get too heavy for animals to live if we don't do it.
Yeah. So for shearing specifically, I mean, there's wool sheep they have to be shorn because they otherwise they suffer quite a bit if they don't. They get too hot, they get too heavy. But what I will say is that's not a sheep in their natural state. So a lot of animals that we farm or have domesticated, they've been we've bred them to be different in a lot of meaningful ways. Like, for example, with broiler chickens who are bred and killed for their meat. Nothing like what a chicken used to be like in the wild. We've bred them to grow faster, which causes a lot of problems. So with a sheep now, I think a sheep who has been bred should be shorn, hopefully in the best way possible. But what I will say is I don't think we should be breeding more. I don't think we should be breeding more sheep that have to be in that situation, because in the same way that I don't think we should be breeding more chickens for their meat, who they grow so fast that their organs can't keep up, and right. Their legs give out and so on. So my view on any industry that involves the use of animals is I want to be able to see these industries to transition to other industries. And so for the example of sheep shearing, I would love to be able to see in the future that industry helping the farmers, helping the individuals in that industry to transition to something else. Because I think it's my view generally is that those industries aren't sustainable and we should be looking at moving to something else.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Michael. We appreciate you lending your expertise and experience to the platform. I'm sure the viewers will appreciate it. We always like having new ideas come across our screens. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's been good. It's been really good to chat with you again. Hopefully we'll catch up in another 2 years and see what happens, maybe sooner.
Well, I don't know if you have time for me if you get elected, but I would enjoy that as well.
All right, sounds good. Thanks so much, Dougal.
All righty, thank you. I'll end this here.
Cheers.